You're listening to the Fan to Fan podcast, and today we're talking about kid-friendly horror, talking about Monster Squad, Stranger Things, Eerie, Indiana, Goosebumps, and more. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to start with the cheesy intro, and we'll kind of go from there, all right?
Perfect.
Welcome to the Fan to Fan podcast. This is your host, Bernie Gonzalez, and I am here with fan and Chicagoland author, Kevin Folliard. Is that right, Kevin?
Folliard, actually.
Folliard, thank you. Okay, Folly, got it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Bernie. This is awesome. I've been writing for about a 12 and up audience. Roughly, I say 12 and up because people just like to have an idea of what age range that is appropriate for your writing. But I always find it an interesting question, like what is for young readers and what is for older readers and what is all ages and what is, where those lines get drawn and how blurry those lines are. But I love scary stories. I love Halloween and scary fiction, and I started writing basically because I wanted to tell the kinds of stories that I really liked to read as a kid and tell the kind of stories that maybe I had a hard time finding when I was a kid too.
So you've published a number of different pieces of fiction, including scary story collections titled Christmas Terror Tales, Valentine Terror Tales, adventure novels for 12 years and up, such as Jake Carter and the Nightmare Gallery, Violet Black and the Curse of Camp Coldwater, and the middle grade fantasy adventure novel Jimmy Chimera and the Temple of Champions. When did you start writing, Kevin?
All my life, really, but I started seriously pursuing publishing and indie publishing in my late 20s, and that's when I wrote Christmas Terror Tales. And that was sort of the project that kind of launched my, I guess what I would consider my adult or my professional like indie writer career. And since then, I've written the other two, Valentine Terror Tales and more Christmas Terror Tales. I've also published in a number of horror magazines and anthologies for more quote unquote adult collections and even some, young adult anthologies. So since then, I've kind of exploded a lot. But Christmas Terror Tales was really the thing that kind of got me going in the horror genre. And it hasn't really slowed down, and I've been having tons of fun doing that.
Your work hasn't been limited to the middle grade crowd, so you had your work collected in, is it Sanitarium magazine, and they feature horror fiction?
Yes, Sanitarium magazine. I had a story published. Also, I'm in a collection called Wax and Wane, a gathering of witch tales, and a road trip themed horror anthology called Bumps in the Road. And I'm also slotted to be in a couple of upcoming 2016 anthologies.
And we met, albeit briefly, at a local convention. You were kind enough to send me an email. I was able to check out some of your work. So, that's kind of like the length of our relationship. But I'm glad that you did send the email because it exposed me to some of your work and some of your interest.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm so glad we connected too. I loved all your artwork and everything. And I was so disappointed when I came back to buy a Batman print and you weren't there. So this is like the next best thing is we get to hang out and talk about scary stories.
All right. So today we're talking about kid-friendly scary stories, and being an author of a number of middle grade sort of horror tales, I guess, is that the best way to describe them?
Yeah, scary stories, horror, terror tales, whatever you want to call them, campfire stories. There's a lot of ways to think about them.
I think we'll start with the really big questions and what makes something kid-friendly in the realm of scary stories.
That is such a great question. And I mean, I don't know that I have a definitive answer to that question. And I think that's because my answer to that question is sort of like, well, according to who? What's scary is so subjective to adults. Something might not be scary to someone who's, desensitized to horror or is really indulged themselves in it. Something that they might find to be very tame might be very scary to another adult. So kids are just as complex as adults. And that's kind of where I try to approach my writing is that, well, I don't know that necessarily a kid can or can't handle this, but when I was a kid, could I handle this is what I try to do. And that's sort of my standard is what was I reading when I was a kid? What was going over my head and what wasn't? And what was I okay with? And what was I sort of confused about? My rule tends to generally be that for writing for young readers, the main things that you don't want to do is you don't want to have gratuity. You don't want to have too much gratuitous violence. You don't want to get into too many gratuitous sexual situations or anything like that. And that's sort of like the firmly bad territory to go into if you think you're going to be writing towards a like 10 to 13-year-old audience. But there's a lot that they can handle. And I think the way that a lot of scary fiction gets censored is unfortunate. Some of it is they're censoring things that basically saying that a scary story can't have consequence, or the characters can't die, or people can't be hurt. And those are all the things that make the genre what it is when there's danger. So for me, again, this is a vague answer, I admit, but there has to be danger and there has to be stakes, no matter what age you're writing to, even if it's a very young child, or they're not going to be scared. And you also have to think about how wide of an appeal do I want this story to have? So some kids are going to be more scared than others, obviously, just like adults. And some kids aren't going to like scary stories at all. And some kids are going to love them. And I think if there's more scary fiction out there for those kids who do love them, then they're more likely to be gravitating towards stuff that's more appropriate for their age level story-wise and character-wise. And then they might hold off on some of the less appropriate themes and ideas that are more adult in nature. And I think I found that when I was a kid, I was always the one who was like trying to read above my level, and sometimes that was fine and sometimes it was not. So like I was reading, Alvin Schwartz and then R.L. Stine, and then all of a sudden it was like, well, what else is there? I guess Stephen King is like the next step up. So like I've always tried to make it my mission to be like a stepping stone, to be like, okay, well, this is a little darker than maybe a kid is used to reading, but it's not so bad that they shouldn't be reading it.
And like you mentioned, you were gravitating towards things that were more adult, ahead of schedule maybe, but versus something is too scary versus being lame. And maybe of those two, being boring or being lame is scarier at the alternative that, that adrenaline rush that you get when you're scared. Right. And if you find that in literature, it brings someone in, and regardless of age, it's more interesting. So, horror, scary stories are just one aspect in that spectrum. I mean, you can get that adrenaline rush from a drama or a romance or what have you, but being interested in things ahead of schedule, like you mentioned, it introduces kids to that larger literary world. So they get exposed to aspects of Gothic horror like Frankenstein and Dracula, Lovecraft, even poetry by Edgar Allan Poe, these things that are such a big part of our pop culture, but they're also staples of the literary culture that if it exposes them to that and maybe they're interested in it, well, maybe they'll gravitate to that as well. They'll explore it and continue that towards, their teenage years into their adulthood.
Absolutely. I think, too, there's just something about speculative fiction like sci-fi, fantasy, and horror that just when kids are into it, they want to open the floodgates and they want to just absorb everything that they can in that genre that they've kind of fallen in love with. And that can be a double-edged sword sometimes. Sometimes there's a lot of great stuff they're getting exposed to, and sometimes there's like, okay, maybe you should wait before you read like Stephen King's It or whatever. But something about that genre in particular, in the escapism of it, I think if a kid really likes it, then they're really all in.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it helps put real life in perspective when you see that there's something out there, whether it's another dimension or the afterlife, whether it's monsters, real or imagined, but, you're looking beyond the safety of the real world. And maybe that helps to, not getting into, any type of psychological study here on a podcast, but I would imagine that can only help develop imagination. You're helping a kid explore different sides of humanity and society. And those are things we learn from. And, big lessons like heroes don't always win. Sometimes bad things happen. There aren't always happy endings, and that's okay. And if along the way you happen to be scared, it's helping you confront fear. It's developing some sort of emotional maturity. And it's not to say that this kid is going to be mature, but, maybe it's just part of a number of different factors that come in with parenting and teachers and music and movies and activities, whatever it is, just a part of a number of different factors that help someone mature. And I think scary stories can easily be dismissed, like especially with any, I think, speculative fiction. And I'm sure you've heard this. You may not take a sci-fi writer or a horror writer as seriously as a dramatic writer, but some of the landscape that you're exploring can be as deep, if not deeper.
Right, definitely. There's definitely a bias against genre fiction, and I think that's unfortunate because that's what a lot of kids are going to gravitate towards. And like you say, you can be just as deep and meaningful, and in some cases more so, especially on that kind of primal level of like fairy tales and scary stories and campfire stories, where there's usually like a very simple but important message buried in a lot of those stories. And a lot of times it might be as simple as, there's danger in this situation, don't do that. But these are really important stories for the development of young people, and I think it's too bad that people dismiss them sometimes as being silly or inappropriate or whatever. And to cushion the scary part of them is sort of the worst thing you can do, to me.
So as a writer, what's the reaction you get when you say that you're not only an author, but the fact that you write, scary stories for kids? What's the reaction you get from people?
All over the place. Yeah. Some people kind of like wrinkle their nose at you and be like, oh, I guess some people like scary things, don't they? Like, you could tell it's all just about taste. Other people think it's awesome. They think it's super cool. They want to know all about it. It's just, everything is so subjective in fiction, and that's totally fine. Especially when I say I write Christmas terror tales, you get a lot of charged reactions from that too sometimes, because people associate Christmas with being just this sort of happy, safe holiday. And it's sort of like, well, that's kind of the point is in horror, is that you take something that is safe or something that you assume is one way and you kind of turn it on its head, like going to the beach and Jaws. It's like, here's something fun, and all of a sudden it's scary. And it's the unexpectedness of it that can be appealing to people.
When we start getting into different examples of kid-friendly, scary stories in media, it's a perfect bridge to get into some of the anthology series that we've been inspired by. And when we were kind of writing back and forth about this one, you'd mentioned Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark? And there are a number of different anthology series that have been made for kids in the same vein of, say, like Twilight Zone, Night Gallery, or even like House of Hammer. But examples of like kids' horror series, Are You Afraid of the Dark? Where you have this group of teenagers, the Midnight Society, that would meet up and tell each other scary stories at night in the middle of the woods. So Weird, which was kind of Disney's teen version of the X-Files, the Nightmare Room.
I remember that, yeah.
Yes, very short-lived unfortunately, for a lot of these series. R.L. Stine's The Haunting Hour, and probably best known of all of them being Goosebumps. Was it the Goosebumps books or the TV series that struck a chord with you?
Well, I first got into the books, and I think it was like a few years before there was a TV series. I remember first discovering R.L. Stine through like a Choose Your Own Adventure book or something that he wrote. I got it out of the school library, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool and scary. And then all of a sudden I realized there was this whole series of scary books by this guy, and they were like these 100-pagers that I could kind of absorb in an afternoon or in a day or two. The first chunk of them were really genuinely pretty creepy. They were obviously written on a level for kids. They were pretty straightforward stories, but he was not afraid to get grim in those stories. The one that really kind of sticks out for me was Let's Get Invisible, if you remember that one. Kind of spoiler alert for it. If anyone wants to go read it, I guess they could stop listening now. But like, it's this old mirror. These kids find this old mirror in the attic, and when you turn this like light on the mirror, it turns you invisible. So of course, being kids, they want to go play a bunch of pranks and goof off while they're invisible. But they gradually learn throughout the course of the story that there's this other like dimension where they have evil doppelgangers, and the longer they stay invisible, the more like weaker they become. And they get sucked through the mirror and like replaced by these evil duplicates. And by the end of the story, this kid's brother gets replaced, and you realize it because he was left-handed or something, and he's suddenly using his right hand at the end of the story. And it was like, they just ended it there. And that really impressed me as a kid. I remember reading that and going, that's a horrible ending. Like, this is not a good situation at all. And the book just ends right there. It does not resolve that problem. So that was one of the first times I think I remember reading a scary book for kids, other than Alvin Schwartz, where something awful happens at the end of the story, and it's the end of the story.
And there were a number of different Goosebumps series, right? Like, Give Yourself Goosebumps and like Goosebumps Presents, and I think those were episodes that were featured in the series. And then there was like Goosebumps Horrorland, Goosebumps 2000.
Yeah, I want to say, I don't know for sure, but I don't think R.L. Stine ever really stopped producing some form of his Goosebumps series. If he did, it was only briefly here and there. But they've remained relevant and in print ever since I was a kid. So good for him. That's awesome. And I finally remember those earlier ones. And I also remember by the time they were on like the 20th book or something, that's when they started going into the kind of goofier, weirder zones and had more of like the funny endings or weird endings versus the creepy ones. And I always kind of wondered if it was parents complaining or, the editors just kind of getting nervous about it, if they just wanted the books to get progressively a little less scary as they went on. But R.L. Stine also had a number of series that were more for older kids too. Like there was I think it was Fear Street was the teenager more geared scary story series he had. So I think their idea was maybe that like the Goosebumps would be kind of progressively was getting tamer, and he had these other series that were for older readers or something.
Goosebumps. Viewer beware, you're in for a scare.
Were you a fan of the Goosebumps TV series?
I was, yeah, I liked it. But like I said, the one thing was when by the time it came around, and I had read a lot of these books, and I was kind of excited to see them adapted into episodes of the TV show. I noticed that the episodes were like appropriately edited down to 20-minute slots, but they also weren't as scary as I remembered them being. And like I said, it was because in my own head I could make the stories as scary as I wanted, whereas on the show it was what it was.
Yeah, I would say there's a few that I remember, and you'll have to tell me if you read them as books and if you remember them. The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight.
Oh, I do. That was a good book. Yeah, that was a fun one.
It's like it plays on the cornfield scarecrow coming to life horror trope, but
Yep.
It just had a really unexpected, creepy, very much unhappy ending. Then there was the episode The Haunted Mask. I don't know if that was made into a book as well, or made from a book.
Yes, it was made from a book, and I think I remember that being like the pilot or something, one of the very first episodes of the TV show that got produced, and that was definitely a creepy one. Is there anything where your will is being taken away or you're being replaced, kind of like the Let's Get Invisible story and episode? It's like that. There's something extra freaky about that. Like in the way the mask is, the premise of the episode is the mask is taking over the girl's identity, and eventually it's not a mask, it's her real face. And she's basically turning into a horrible monster.
Yeah, and dealing with like issues of conformity, especially when it's targeting a preteen audience, dealing with things like peer pressure or maybe moving from grade school to high school. I mean, it's just great material for a kid, a preteen or a teenager that's watching this, and it's identifying with some of the same issues, the same emotions that these characters are dealing with, but in a very controlled, scary situation.
Right, yeah.
There was a quote from R.L. Stine that I found where he said he wrote books because he just likes to scare kids, but then he kind of expanded on that and said, kids love to be scared, but not too scared. You can laugh at the fear, walk through the fear, then put the book down. So, I mean, that is the great thing about any scary story. In the end, you're in control. You can always just walk away, turn off the TV, put the book down like he suggested, take yourself away from it. But then it's always just fun to go back.
Yeah, that's so insightful. I mean, that's a great quote from him. I've always thought that about horror and why I write horror and who I hope is enjoying it and how I hope they feel when they do genuinely get scared by something I wrote. The cool thing about horror is that ideally you're not reading a book alone in the woods getting chased by, an evil person. You're sitting in your chair in your house and you have a nice fire going or something and, some hot tea or cocoa next to you, and you're just sort of vicariously living through a dangerous situation. Like you said, it's about kind of like mental adrenaline that you get going through you from just pretending you're in this awful situation along with these characters and thinking about what would I do if this character was me, if something like this was happening to me. And it kind of gives you this sense of vindication that you can explore a terrible situation but not actually be in one.
In just a few seconds, Kevin and I talk about the horror mystery kids classic TV series Eerie, Indiana. But in the meantime, if you are listening on iTunes, please take a moment to rate and review. Just search for the Fan to Fan podcast, go under reviews, enter a star rating, or write a review if you have a second or two, and click send. That's how easy it is. I will greatly appreciate it. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
So go back to Joe Dante, because he was not only did he direct Gremlins, but he was also the creative consultant for Erie, Indiana, if you remember that series.
I do remember that series, not as well as Goosebumps, but I definitely remember it.
My name is Marshall Teller. I knew my new hometown was going to be different from where I grew up in New Jersey, but this is ridiculous. Nobody believes me, but Erie, Indiana is the center of weirdness for the entire planet. Still don't believe me? You will.
Yeah, it aired on NBC from in 91 to 92. Didn't have many episodes, only 19, but Joe Dante was a creative consultant. He directed Piranha, The Howling, Gremlins, Explorers, The Burbs, and Small Soldiers. The final episodes didn't really air until it was syndicated on Disney Channel, but I mean, the show has had quite a cult following. Even at the time, Fox recognized it, and they made a spinoff called Erie, Indiana, The Other Dimension that came out in 98 and only lasted for 15 episodes for one season. But it's a show that I remember along with shows like Goosebumps and So Weird, because it was different. It was original, but it was also, it's kind of similar to the movie The Burbs, that the series played on the idea that there were supernatural or fantastic elements hidden underneath like this very
normal place.
Exactly, yeah. The idea of like this very innocuous suburbia, but the show was created with this preteen perspective. But the appeal, the humor, the horror, it was strong and it was subtle enough that it played well with adults. And it had these references to like the Universal monsters, like the Mummy and the Wolfman, but also to like Terminator and The Fly, to pop culture icons that kids and adults would recognize.
Yeah, and what was cool about Erie, Indiana, too, was that it was unlike Goosebumps, which was an anthology show, which I love for its own reasons, but you could get attached to the main characters because it's going to be the same main characters who are encountering the weird situations every week. Kind of like X-Files, in a way, where you get attached to the characters, but the situation starts fresh pretty much every single time, where it's a new monster of the week or situation of the week.
Yeah, and Erie, Indiana followed teenager Marshall Teller and his sidekick Simon Holmes, and they were in this so Marshall's family moves to this small Midwest town of Erie, Indiana, and then while they're there, they're unraveling all these mysteries. They're confronting bizarre characters, so they ran into Bigfoot, Elvis Presley, Captain Ahab. There was even an episode where one of them was at the dentist and got these braces put in, and it allowed him to hear all the talking dogs and how they were trying to take over the world.
I remember that one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It was fun, but there were these horror elements that were involved. But again, targeted to a preteen audience, but very much something that adults could understand. The morality tales that they were trying to tell, and and that they were in each episode. And like you said, because it was this narrative, you could follow along with the characters, and see how they were being exposed to all these crazy things. And it had a few fans because Alex Hirsch, who went on to create Gravity Falls, was absolutely inspired by Erie, Indiana. And when you think about the premise for Gravity Falls, it was a cartoon series on Cartoon Network where the siblings spend a summer with their great uncle, who happens to live in a small town that's filled with paranormal forces and supernatural creatures. It's basically Erie, Indiana instead of Gravity Falls.
That's really cool. Yeah, it's always fun to hear about the shows and the movies and books and things that influence people to go on and do something else. I do kind of remember an episode of Erie, Indiana, kind of playing off what you were saying about the innocuous suburbia of the setting. There was an episode that I'm remembering that involved the moms were all having Tupperware parties, and like there was something about the Tupperware like that brainwashed people or did something weird, and this mom kept her kids sealed in the Tupperware, so they were really like 50 years old or 40 years old or something.
It was the two twins, right?
Yes. Yeah, there were two twins, and the mom like kept them young inside the Tupperware. And it was just like a really very funny and weird kind of situation, but also kind of like it had its own creepiness and danger to it. Like even though it's Tupperware, it's still horror. And like I always like that when you could take something that's very normal or very innocent seeming and make it sort of sinister and strange.
So let's go back to, you mentioned books that influence, and we kind of mentioned it briefly before. So Alvin Schwartz's series, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, a series of 3 children's book written by Alvin Schwartz. And of course, we can't forget the illustrations by Stephen Gammell. And I know the author or rather the illustrator for the Lemony Snicket series, I think for the 30th anniversary of the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark series, he went back and did some illustrations. But when I think of these series of books, the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, Scary Stories, 3 More Tales to Chew Your Bones, in my mind, they always feature those original Stephen Gammell illustrations that were kind of sketchy and surreal, and they were scarier than you might imagine for a kid's book.
Yes.
And I mean, the fact that the stories were probably some of my first time I was exposed to these kind of sleepover stories, folklore, urban legends, like we mentioned before, the Scarecrow coming to life, these things that Alvin Schwartz was using that they'd heard of that, but, he's putting them in this setting that's supposed to be for kids, but, was much scarier.
Exactly. You're totally right about the Stephen Gammell artwork. It's phenomenal. It's every bit as important to those stories to me as the actual stories themselves that Schwartz was collecting. And I do really like Brett Helquist too, who does Series of Unfortunate Events, and his illustrations are cool in the re-release that they did as well. But if you really want to experience these stories, you have to read them with those original illustrations, because they are just chilling, and they just take you into this whole new world of dark, strange things. But I totally agree with you. I think for most kids, a lot of kids at least, that these stories are the things that like showed them what a scary story is. And everyone kind of usually says they got into them around 4th or 5th grade. And I think that was the book that everyone wanted to check out of the library. That was one that they passed around, and they read at sleepovers and everything. And they were all also raw and just direct. Part of what I really got out of those stories as an adult writer was coming up with that idea for Christmas Terror Tales, and then like going back to this book, or these 3 books really, and looking at how precise the sentences and the language were. They were, not a word is wasted in those stories. They're just so direct and so singular in their effect on you. That's really helped me with my own writing actually a lot, even beyond writing scary stories.
And you mentioned that some of his other books, like in a dark, dark room, that influenced you as well.
Definitely. In a Dark, Dark Room and Other Scary Stories is another book by Schwartz, and it has pictures by Dirk Zimmer. And I remember reading this book before I ever, encountered the Other Scary Stories books that Schwartz did. My brother and I had this like book on tape in the Dark, Dark Room. And I don't know if you remember, they used to have these books on tapes where it would be like, when you hear this sound, turn the page, and you would just like, your parents would pop a cassette tape in for you and like walk away, and the cassette tape would read the book to you. But I remember,
absolutely, yes,
yeah, there's 2 stories in here that I think are just phenomenal. And the illustrations are phenomenal. And these are for like, 2nd graders, 1st graders. They're really like meant for really little kids, but they are genuinely creepy. There's one about this kid going home from, it's called The Teeth. It's this kid walking home from school, and he keeps encountering these weird strangers, and each one progressively has longer and creepier teeth until finally he like runs all the way home. And there's like very little to the actual narrative, but like you said, it's all in the drawings of these weird guys with these creepy teeth. And then there's this really simple, the story the book is named after, In a Dark, Dark Room, is what it reminds me of that book on tape. Because I remember me and my brother and my cousin Kelly, and Kelly was the youngest of us, we were all sitting around listening to this book on tape. And it goes, in a dark, dark wood, there's a dark, dark house. And it just keeps going through the dark house, through the dark room, into the dark cabinet and the dark chest and everything. And finally, at the end of the story, it's just in the dark, dark chest there was, and then you turn the page.
And in that dark, dark box, there was
a ghost. And there's this huge, brightly colored, terrifyingly creepy looking ghost. Doesn't look like the kind of ghost you would see normally on like Halloween decorations. He's got a hideous face and like weird hairy looking ears and moles and stuff. And my cousin Kelly just screamed and ran out of the room because she was so scared of the revelation of a ghost coming out of a chest. When you think about it, like conceptually, that's just so basic, like there's nothing that scary about it. It's all in this artwork and in the suspense that he's building up for these young readers. Every page you turn, there's a new thing, and he keeps repeating the word dark. And, the illustrations are dark. So it's just cool to me in these kids' stories that suspense can exist on this level that is so primal.
And there's all these things that are kind of happening in the background. Because, if you think about context, if you're reading a book like this and you're under your covers with the flashlight on, that adds a completely different dimension to a book. Just like if you're in the basement watching a movie by yourself.
In just a few moments, Kevin and I will discuss the 1987 horror comedy cult classic Monster Squad. But remember, you can find the Fan to Fan podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan to Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN, or on Twitter at Fan to Fan Podcast. I'd love to hear from you, so reach out, send a message, and let me know what you think of the show. Thanks.
For me, there were a few movies, especially in the 80s, like you mentioned, The Gremlins, but Something Wicked This Way Comes, or The Watcher in the Woods. Yeah. These kind of like great 80s movies that, as a kid, as you're watching it. And I think, as we've moved on, more recent movies like Paranorman or even Coraline or Frankenweenie, a lot of Tim Burton has been great at this, is being able to kind of walk this fine edge of things that are scary, but they have elements of humor and they have elements of drama, some very adult aspects of storytelling. But some of those 80s movies really stuck with me, and one of them was Monster Squad. So I don't know if you saw that growing up.
I used to rent that one all the time. Yeah, you're right. It's all about like the mood and just sort of like the careful balancing of a fun, exciting adventure with the genuinely scary moments. I always think the most memorable movies for kids have that. Across the board, the 80s was definitely a great time to be a kid and watching scary movies because, Monster Squad, because they play the scares straight.
And something like Monster Squad, where it's basing everything completely on your knowledge of the Universal monsters. And growing up in Chicagoland, we had Svengoolie, we had Creature Features. Right. We had these awesome, just like staples that you'd watch on a Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening. And I just remember when I saw Monster Squad for the first time, I thought, wow, like I know who all these characters are. I know who the Dracula is. I know who the Gill-Man is, the werewolf and Frankenstein. Yeah. But then to put them in this setting.
You know who to call when you have ghosts. But who do you call when you have monsters?
We're the Monster Squad.
What's a squad? It's like Miami Vice, I think.
They're young and inexperienced.
Monsters are not real.
We don't know that, sir.
But when strange things start happening in town, they're the only ones ready to do battle. The Monster Squad.
Shane Black, who wrote it, and he went on to write Lethal Weapon, directed Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, and directed Iron Man 3. Right. And Fred Decker, who directed it, who then did Night of the Creeps, and he worked on the Tales from the Crypt TV series. He also co-wrote RoboCop 3 with Frank Miller, but we'll forget that one. But just, the idea of the society of young preteens in the Monster Squad and how they idolize all these classic monsters, and easily as a kid, I could have been one of them, and to go on this adventure where they're finding this diary, translating it from German, finding out about this magical amulet that'll help them protect the world from the one day out of every century where the forces of good and evil reach a balance, and the only way to stop them is through this magical amulet. It's just great fodder for a kid growing up.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I love about horror as a genre is there's so much material, and like just kind of like you said, like you can take a kids movie like that and turn it into a love letter to like the classic monsters, and it's all about how much you kind of embrace that monster and how you kind of give it your own little spin and the context you put it in. And like it can be done badly, of course. Like we've had so many vampire movies that have put so many iffy spins on vampires, for example. There's so much zombie stuff right now, and a lot of it's really good, but there's a lot of it. So like you can overdo it, but like the nice thing is that that you can generally think about something like a scarecrow comes to life or an evil Santa Claus, which I've done in a lot of my scary stories, and said, well, I want to do this, but I want to do it in a new way, or I want to do it in my way, or I want to do it according to this theme of this collection that I'm working on. So that's a lot of fun. It's fun as an audience member. It's fun as a writer too.
Yeah, and thinking about repurposing kind of like these old things that we remember, like Stranger Things is a perfect present day example.
Definitely.
The reception that it's had is just it just speaks to itself. The fact that it's been able to be this homage to like John Carpenter and Spielberg movies like E.T. Then there's like the elements of Firestarter, John Hughes movies, the Stephen King elements, all this Goonies, Dungeons and Dragons, and all just like 1980s television. But it uses all that nostalgia. So if you're watching Monster Squad and you're aware of the Universal monsters and you saw Dracula or the Frankenstein or the Wolfman as a kid, and you're remembering how scary that was, you're watching Stranger Things through the lens of all these different references, and it's adding context to the narrative. So it's not just 8 episodes that the Duffer Brothers were able to do really well, but it's 8 episodes of this series, and you're bringing all this stuff in there along with it.
Yeah, Stranger Things is such a fantastic example of homaging done right. And it's come at a very opportune time, I feel like, to point at, other things like Hollywood remakes, where it's like there's been a lot of remakes about a lot of things. Some of them are good, some of them are okay, some of them are bad. Generally, you talk to a lot of people and they say, I'm so sick of remakes. But Stranger Things kind of gets it in that you don't have to remake the story. You just have to recreate the feeling and tell a new story. So the cool thing about Stranger Things is people like us can watch it and go, this makes me feel like a kid in the 80s watching this really cool movie or this really cool TV show. But you could show it to today's 12-year-old who never had that feeling in the 80s, and they'll still think it's cool because there's something about it that worked then and still works now.
There's something very honest about Stranger Things.
Yeah.
And whether we're watching it, having grown up in the 80s and understanding these references, or you have a kid now watching it, that honesty is the same. There's something just very genuine about their friendships and the experiences that they go through, and how, they start with this incredibly extraordinary circumstance where one of their friends is kidnapped, but, then they go through all of these adventures to try to help their friend and bring their friend Will back. It's just perfect for a kid who's riding their bike on a cul-de-sac, and instead of maybe a walkie-talkie, now you might have a kid who's using an app and they're just talking to their friend and texting.
Right.
And they're living out the same adventure. It's just the present day instead of the 80s.
Right.
But the idea is the same.
Yeah. Another thing I love about Stranger Things is how surprising it was able to be narratively. It warms you up to characters early on who all of a sudden out of nowhere get killed, and you go, oh my God, like that guy was going to be important, and it takes a lot of turns, and shifts your feelings about characters and then shifts them back the other way. And like what you were saying, it's a very honest portrayal of the way people really are, but an endearingly honest portrayal.
And it's honest to kids, because I think there's also a way where, like you mentioned before, if you're starting to seek out fiction that's a little scarier, that's a bit more adult, you're not necessarily writing down or creating a story, a movie, a TV series, whatever it is, and you're kind of dumbing it down for kids. You're saying, hey, in life, unfortunately, people die and they go through some really unfortunate circumstances, and an unfortunate circumstance could be divorce, or it could be a creature from the upside down that comes out. But either way, these circumstances are scary, but they're scary and they're real. So let's put it out there and let's let kids process it, and let's see what they think about it.
Exactly. I think that's really important, that you don't dumb down real life, because if we're dumbing down real life, then we're in trouble. I mean, we can't make real life go away. So we might as well just engage it.
So now, do you have any kids, Kevin?
I don't, actually. I have 2 nephews and a niece and a goddaughter, and my friends have kids. So there are kids in my life, but I don't have to watch them 24 hours a day.
Have you exposed them to any of these, scary stories that have influenced you along the way?
They're all pretty young right now, so I'm always trying to think, like, how soon. Like, in a dark room, what we just talked about is probably like the first one that I will like buy for them. Probably I could start reading that to them now, but they do like Halloween. They love dressing up. I always go to a Halloween party with my goddaughter every year, so that's a lot of fun. Trick or treat with them.
So a little too early to have them start reading your books, right?
Yeah, my books are, like I said, they're more 12 and up, as I say, maybe 10 and up. Yeah, they're still like the oldest of the kids in my life is probably 4. So I'm just sort of chomping at the bit like, come on, I don't want to traumatize you, but we're going to be into this together eventually, right?
They might revoke your Godfather privileges at that point.
I know, yeah, I got to be careful about that.
All right, so speaking of your books, they're available on Amazon for Kindle. Your website, www.kevinfolliard, FOLLIARD.com, right?
Exactly.
Folks can find out more about you, your works, and they can also check out book trailers and more.
Yep. Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at KMFOLLIA as well. So I do all the social media and all that fun stuff.
And along with Cornstalk, the story that you have in the upcoming Kindred Souls anthology, anything else that you have that you're working on?
Well, I have another story coming out. It's from Wolfsinger Publications, and the anthology is going to be called Just Desserts. It's a revenge-themed anthology. So my story, The Hollow Tree, will be in that anthology, which I think will be out by November, but I don't have an exact release date for that one. Beyond that, I have a lot of stuff I'm working on. I've got a whole stack of scary stories and short stories and short fiction and flash fiction. So there'll definitely be more stuff. It's just a matter of where it ends up and how it ends up there.
Awesome. So, yes, please keep them coming.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That's it for this episode. Tune in next time for more fan-to-fan conversations on the Fan-to-Fan podcast. Thanks for listening.
They rise at night and can't be stopped. They're the walking dead who were never buried. And they're coming your way now in Horror of the Zombies.